to the slides about privilege escalation. And then let's also, I'm going to, at the end of the slides, it's going to be some resources, specifically a couple of scripts that are people have found good success with. But the thing is, those scripts will try, you'll see these scripts, it's going to run, it's going to try a ton of different things. And you're going to get back a ton of information. Luckily, one of them kind of color codes it and with like a priority, so you can kind of know like which items to start with. But you're going to see like this world of privilege escalation outside of, once you're not dealing with kernel exploits, there's so many things to try. There's so many paths. And it's just like the same way, like with these exploits that you get against the machines, like all these exploits have been slightly different, right? Just a little twist, right? And you're going to find the same thing with privilege escalation. So like the same, you have to have that same mindset that you had when you were trying to crack that box after you get in and you're trying to escalate your privileges. Let me share my screen. And you folks can see the slides? Okay. So just kind of, we've kind of done the brief overview. We'll talk about some of the general techniques and misconfigured permissions on how you can get into, how you can escalate privileges once you've gained access to a machine. So when we're trying to exploit a box, we're trying to exploit either a bug or a misconfiguration in the software or the setup of that, either that network or that server to exploit to gain access. Privilege escalation is the same thing. We're going to be exploiting either a bug in software or configuration on that operating system to allow us to switch from a lower privileged user to a higher privileged user. So once you get on the box and you've gotten you get a user account, you're basically starting that recon again. You're starting that process all over again. Now it's more focused. You're focused on the inside of the box and you have a little bit more visibility, but you're basically doing recon again. Don't forget about things that you may have found during passive recon, right? Like if you've done passive recon on this box, don't, like, for example, with core, and there was a blog post that says something about I'm the mightiest princess or something along those lines. And then the password for the admin for that WordPress site happened to be princess as well. So looking around and finding what information that you have there, and then just kind of, if there's any information that seems personal to a particular user, that may come in handy again. Once you're on the box, you're gonna need to do the same kind of recon that you do on the outside, like whereas you had Nmap to give you that OS and the OS version, now you need to reconfirm that once you're on the inside. Reconfirm that once you're on the inside, and then also reconfirm all the other, the information that you got from Nmap on the outside, reconfirm it once you get to the inside. And then also look for, you're gonna then use that information to look for your exploits. We spent a day on file transfers, right? Different ways that you can transfer files over a network. Likely, especially on a Windows machine, you're likely not to have many tools available by default on a Windows machine. A Linux machine, you'll have more tools, but you may not have everything that you're used to. So your file transferring skills are going to have to get sharpened once you start running into boxes that aren't boot to root, right? Because you're going to likely need to transfer some kind of utility to get to your machine to help you exploit it. In your Kali machine, you have obviously you have the Linux resources, but there's also a folder, user share Windows resources. And I believe there's also user share Windows binaries. Bunch of tools that you can use, Windows tools, for exploiting Windows machines. This interpreter shell thing, if at all possible, if you were able to get a reverse shell to a machine, but it's awful, see if you can't use that same process, but instead of just doing a plain reverse shell or bind shell, whichever the case may be, see if you can't use the interpreter version, and then use that with Metasploit, and then that will ease the burden some, right? Because the interpreter shell like has that upload and download functionality built right in, right? So you then don't need to like find something that you're gonna like on a Windows machine. I told you about that search util executable that you can use as kind of a makeshift wget. But depending on the version of Windows, that might not be available. And then you're gonna have to, try to find something. See if you can't get access to the desktop so that you can use a browser, and then you spin up your own, your Apache or your Python simple web server to use HTTP. And then depending on your user access, you may not have many places where you can put your files once you've found a way to get them, right? You may not have access to write to many places. So if you find yourself with a user that doesn't have many write permissions, you need to start looking for the temp directory. Always remember the temp directory, everybody can write there. And on Windows, you can use these variables. So the same way on Linux, when you want to use a environment variable, you preface it with that $sign. In Windows, when you want to talk about environment variables, you would just use these. You surround the variable name with %signs. So there's always, Windows has a temp folder as well that you can find. And if you can't find the temp folder, you can find it with the temp variable, or sometimes the public variable. If you're lucky enough and you find a kernel exploit, you're likely going to have to compile it. And there are even exploits that are not kernel exploits that you may have to compile. When you're compiling, so if you're on a Linux box, many times you can if you could do which GCC. GCC is a tool that's used to compile C files on Linux. If on your target machine you have access to GCC, that's going to make life easier, because then you can just transfer your exploit to the target and compile it on the target. That way, you don't have to do any flags. It just by default, it will compile in the version that works on that machine. But if you're compiling it on your machine, if there's no GCC there, and you need to compile it on your machine, you need to be mindful of the architecture of the target machine. Your Kali VM is likely 64-bit. If you're using 2020, it's 64-bit. If you're using 2018, I think 2018 is 32-bit. Pretty sure about that. But your target may be 32-bit or maybe 64-bit. You need to have that in mind and make sure that you are compiling it for the right architecture. Yeah, so read the exploit, and like I said, we're not gonna touch on C, but you should be able to look at C and get an idea of what's going on, and hopefully there are a set of good instructions included in your exploit. Sometimes you'll get the flags. Sometimes these exploit developers will actually give you the flags that you need to compile it for alternate architectures, which is great. But other times you may not, and you may just need to try to compile it, try to run it. You're going to get an error message, and then you're going to need to spend some time Googling that error message to find out what's wrong, what's the flag that you need to use to compile it to get rid of that error message. And you may go to 2 or 3 rounds of that, of discovering the flag that you need to use when you're compiling. Just also, these are just kind of like reminders. Do you need to use DOS to Unix to change that file? So if the exploit was written in Unix, and we see this with search exploit a lot, I always just run DOS to Unix just when I download a file. Just it doesn't hurt, right? If the file is already in Unix format, nothing will change. And if it's in Windows format, you do it one time, get it out the way.
Frank, can you just how do I know if I need to do that? Or like, what's the common error that I would see that I'm like, oh, got to run DOS to Unix?
Okay, let me let's do this. Go back. I remember it's something like you oftentimes when you do it with a Python script, yeah, you get this. So if I were to do, let's do search exploit, and what was it? Shell shock. And which was 34,900. So I'm going to do search exploit -m 34,900. And if you pay attention, it will actually tell you, right? File type Python script with carriage return line feed line terminators. To be honest, I'd never read this, and I just do DOS to Unix by default. But if I try to run this without running DOS to Unix, I'm gonna get something with a yeah, Python/r no such file directory, because instead of ending the line with just the \n, these lines are with the \r/n. So the cat-a Python 34. And you see here, the $ is for your \n, and this $m is the /r. So if I then do DOS to Unix on 34,900 and do that again, now you see just the $, which is the /n. And that cat-A is it just shows non-printing characters, right? So if you look again, you see here's this tab this $I. These are the tabs that are for the indenting in in Python. And Matt, you saying something? Okay. So just be aware of how you're compiling it. These are flags that you can use. App update and app upgrade to make sure you get the latest version of your tools. And MinGW W64 is something that you can use to get the tools for compiling executables for Windows on Linux. So you can actually make it a Windows executable from your Kali Linux machine. And we just talk about at a high level, some techniques that you can use when you're trying to do privilege escalation. One, look for that version and try to find a kernel exploit, right? Try to find that easy button, right? This kernel exploit will just give you the system. Once you compile it and run it, that's it, that's done. Try to exploit a particular service on the system. Are the services running with higher privileges than you that you can use to get the privileges that you need? Hash dump, like we saw with Meterpreter, where you can do that hash dump and get those hashes, or if you can somehow get the hashes from Linux, if you can get Etsy Shadow, crack those passwords. Data leaking. Is there any data is there any application or any information that's just been left about that's useful, right? Not just like on a website, but like you have access to the file system now. Start looking in user directories, see what people have in their documents, what's in there. Misconfigured permissions is something running with higher permissions than it really needs. Process hijacking, where you're going to essentially take a process that has higher permissions, and you're gonna, instead of making it do its usual task, its usual service, you're gonna make it run an executable of your choosing. Kernel exploits. So typically what a kernel exploit is doing is it's involving making some kind of system call that is running with elevated permissions. And a lot of times what you'll see is some kernel exploits, they don't actually give you, like they don't just make you root. What they'll do is if you actually look inside and look at the code, somewhere at the end you'll see a process that's actually calling like bin bash or bin sh, but it's calling it in such a certain way. It's calling it via a process that allows that's going to create that shell with root privileges. So that then once that shell has been executed, you executed that process executes that shell comes back to you, and that shell is a root shell, right? So they're at the end of the day, they're just they're taking advantage of bugs in the kernel, in the low level operating system. This can also affect certain kernel defenses, modifying permissions. You'll see this as well. Sometimes they will modify permissions of a particular, they will allow you, instead of giving you a actual shell, they will give you, they will modify something that's running with SUID to allow you to run that. And then once you're running that, then you will, like with, which machine was it? Where we used Nmap hotline, where we used Nmap to then give us a root shell, because Nmap was running with setuid privileges. Service exploits, taking advantage of services that are running with higher permissions. So when you first get onto a box, one of the things that we kind of stress, especially when you get onto a Linux box, is to do sudo-l, right? Sudo-l will list all of the privileges that the current user has that they can run with root privileges. Anything that you can run with root privileges, then you want to do some research and find out, now that I can run this with root privileges, how can I make advantage of this to actually get a root shell? With Windows, you want to go to take a look at the local group administrators. Is there a service that will allow you to add a user to this group, right? Can you add yourself to this group? Is that possible? On Linux machines, you can do a search to find all the executables that have the SUID bit set. And then depending on which ones are set, which executables have that, that set, you can try to hack them so that you can get root permissions. If you didn't know, you can use, this is a command line that you can use to actually find them. We're just going to use the regular old find utility. We'll just find starting at the root, and then here's a flag, the -perm, and then we give it user equals S or G equals S, the group equals S, or user has the sticky bit set, and then we're throwing the caret is to throw any error message away to dev null. So once you find one that has that SUID bit set, we're going to try to use it in a way that we can get it to execute a shell for us. Also take a look at what's running, what services are currently running on your machine, and see which of those services are running with root. Like when you do AUX, you will see in addition to the process name and the process ID, it will show you who's running that process. If you can hijack that process, you can then run that process as root. Password hacks. So on Windows, these are all utilities that you can use to try and dump the passwords, to try and just, and if they work, they're just going to give you the password right there and there. So they're great, but they don't always work. So just try them and see. Like I said, this is going to be with privilege escalation. There's a lot of just going down a checklist and trying different things and seeing what happens. You can also do a pass the hash attacks, where maybe you get an NTLM hash where you're not going to likely be able to crack it, but can you pass the hash? Can you then use that hash and provide that hash to another service as the authentication, so that instead of providing the password, provide the actual hash to be granted authentication. Mimikatz is another tool that you can use. Mimikatz is this whole other thing. You can use Mimikatz to dump passwords as well. Mimikatz, I think, is probably where you should start on a Windows machine if you're talking about trying to dump the passwords. Misconfigured permissions, like I said, there's just a ton of different things too that you can check. So this is going back to that sudo-l, right? Doing sudo-l, and you can see that this test user can run Git without a password, right? So even if you got access to the test user, even if you didn't get access to him by getting that password, you can still run sudo-l or run sudo git. And then if is there a way that you can hack Git to get it to run a root shell for you? Just checking back with set UID bits. Some of this is just kind of going back and forth to things that we've already said. And then on Windows, there is this utility called ICACLs, which ACLs are your access control lists. And this will allow you to see and modify ACLs. So if you have access to this utility, this can be helpful as well. So also, then we talked about looking around. So looking that user's folder, looking everywhere you can, see what you can find. On a Windows machine, right? Look in your text and your docx files. On a Linux file, look in all those .conf files. Those are all configuration files. See if there's any information in there that's helpful. Search those configuration files for passwords, and then try and see if you can't do any kind of password reuse. You can also potentially look for the user's cookies, right? If you have access to that user's local profile, and see, can you reuse any of those cookies to have access to any web apps that person has? Metasploit has these post modules. So if you got in through Metasploit, you can try using these post modules in num for IE or in num for Chrome, which will try and get any information and see what kind of access to what other sites you can get with that information. Look at log files and see what kind of information is being logged there. Are there any errors in the log files about potentially trying to access systems? Config files, SQL files, JSON files, trying to connect to the database. All of this are just different ways that there's all these different avenues that you can go into. And then here we're talking about process hijacking, where you attempt to use a service that has higher permissions and then pervert it to use your another process. So we talked about this briefly before, but on Windows machines, if the path to a machine has a space in it, you can create a directory. So if it's located in the program space files directory, you can create a directory called program, and then in that directory, create another file with that same name of that executable, and then it'll run from there. It'll run from that program directory instead of from the program files directory, because of how certain versions of Windows handle files that have space names in them. Hot potato and juicy potato. This is a useful tool, just kind of like the same way that Eternal Blue is like a great exploit to get you into a machine. Hot potato and juicy potato are good tools to use to elevate your privileges on a Windows machine. there's just a ton of things to go through. And then here's some other things. Power up. This is a PowerShell script that you can use, and some other PowerShell things you can use. But I want to get to these other resources, because these are the resources that I tend to lean on the most. So here we have this GTFO bins, which is a website that's going to have a ton of different Linux binaries and how you can use those binaries to get root shells. And then this LOLBAS is a similar concept, but for Windows. So if we go to, let me bring up my browser, share my screen. And this is GTFO bins, right? And here are all these different Linux utilities, right? And what you can see, if we can just search for one. So we know that, like how we used Nmap before, we can just search for Nmap. And here is the Nmap utility. And if we just click here, here's a bunch of different ways that we can use Nmap to get shells. So we can do Nmap -- interactive, which will give us a shell, and then Nmap -- interactive, then bang sh to give us a shell, which I think is what we did on Hotline. But then here are just a bunch of other ways that you can use Nmap for different to get shells. So GTFO bins, and then LOLBAS, which is similar thing, but for Windows utilities. So once you get on a Linux or Windows machine, you can then reference one of these and see which tools you have access to, which tools, any of these tools on here that you have the set UID bit set, or the group set UID bit set, and then look for them on GTFO or LOL. And then they basically give you a way that you can then use these tools to escalate your privileges. Another thing that I'm going to recommend that you take a look at is, go back here, this privilege escalation awesome scripts suite. And basically in here, there's two scripts. There's one linpeas and one winpeas. And linpeas is for Linux, winpeas is for Windows. And basically, this is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But the only thing is, this is what I was talking about before when I said, this is going to give you back a ton of information. Luckily that it will be color coded, and so that you can kind of try and find the best, you start from the best, the most likely avenues first, but it is just a ton of information to go through. And then in addition, I think this is going to be the last thing. If you go to this privilege escalation awesome script suite on the actual homepage, on this README, right, there's a link here to these checklists, one for Windows and one for Linux for privilege escalation. And so if we go to these checklists, like this Linux privilege escalation, here's just like all the things that you need to do, or that you can do. So just like get the OS information, check the path, all of these different things. And then there's links to just more information about these different attack vectors. But if you see, there's just so many different possible ways to go down that privilege escalation is just going to be, and especially on the Windows side, because we've done more, and you've kind of gotten used to, you've lived in your Cali for a while, so you've kind of gotten used to that. The Windows side, and things on the Windows side just work differently. But I'd really recommend that you use one of these tools to kind of get an idea of kind of where to start, or an avenue that you can head down out. You can head down initially, but it's really, when you start the privilege escalation, it's really just a lot of trial and error. It really is. Were there any questions or comments? All right, so I'm gonna open up back the breakout rooms. Go ahead, go back to working on Bob. And then when you come back, so we're gonna work through Bob until lunch. When you come back from lunch, I'll give you, I'm actually, it's not even a hint, I'm gonna give you a resource that's gonna lay out what you need to do. But it's still gonna be tricky. It's tricky to get Bob to work, but. All right, so with that, since there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms.